rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it haunted. It was a relentless rhythmic percussion against the rusted, oxidized roof of Silas Thorne's 2012 Ford F-150. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time when the city's heart usually slowed to a dull thrum. But for Silas, the night was just another layer of his exhaustion. He sat in the cab of his truck, the engine idling with a rhythmic, metallic rattle, a mechanical cough that mirrored the weariness deep in his own marrow. The windshield wipers struggled against the deluge, squeaking across the glass in a hypnotic, irritating tempo. Swish thud. Swish thud. It was a perfect metaphor for his life over the last 3 years, a constant losing battle against an overwhelming, invisible force. Silas was 35 years old, though the flickering amber light of the dashboard made him look closer to 50. His eyes, which had once sparkled with the intellectual fire of a man who designed the structural skeletons of the world's most ambitious skyscrapers, were now bloodshot, sunken, and clouded with a permanent veil of grief. His hands, the hands of a genius architect who could calculate wind loads and seismic drifts to the fourth decimal point in his head, were now stained with the black grease of industrial elevators and the permanent calluses of a man who worked double shifts just to keep the heat on. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Just one more day, he whispered to the empty cab. It was the lie he told himself every night. 3 years ago, Silas Thorne was a name whispered with reverence in the halls of Vance Dynamics. He was the golden boy, the senior systems architect who had married Sarah, a woman who smelled of lavender and aged paper, a woman who could find the hidden beauty in a raw structural blueprint. They had a life that felt like a permanent sunrise. They had plans. They had a future. Then the fire happened. It had gutted the commercial office building where Sarah worked, a building ironically managed by a subsidiary of Vance Dynamics. The official report called it an electrical fault, a tragic accident. But Silas knew the truth. He had found the discrepancies in the wiring specs months before the tragedy. He had filed the reports warning of the catastrophic risk. Those reports, however, were his death warrant. Dominic Sterling, the vice president of operations, hadn't just ignored the warnings. He had used them as a weapon. In the wake of the fire, Sterling framed Silas for the very negligence that killed his wife, claiming Silas had signed off on the faulty specs himself. He presented Silas with a terrifying choice-face federal prosecution for involuntary manslaughter and lose his daughter to the foster system or sign away his rights to investigate Sarah's death. Take a permanent demotion to a maintenance technician and disappear into the corporate shadows. Looking at the innocent face of his then 4-year-old daughter, Clara, Silas had chosen the wrench over the prison cell. He became a ghost scrubbing the floors and fixing the pipes of the very men who had stolen his life. Tonight, Silas turned off the ignition. The silence that filled the truck was heavy. He opened the door and stepped out the cold water, soaking through his thin work jacket instantly. He climbed the stairs to his third-floor apartment, each step a sharp protest from his aching knees. The wood groaned under his heavy steel-toed work boots. Inside, the air was usually stale, smelling of damp carpet and the lonely metallic tang of a life lived in survival mode. But as he crossed the threshold, his senses spiked. A faint, unmistakable scent of jasmine and expensive bergamot cut through the gloom. It was a fragrance that belonged in a glass penthouse overlooking Lake Union, not a $60 a week rental unit in a crumbling suburb. Silas froze. His adrenaline surged, washing away the fatigue. His fingers instinctively curled around a heavy steel pipe wrench in his tool belt. His pulse hammered in his throat. Who is here? He moved silently toward the kitchen. The light was on, casting a warm yellow rectangle onto the hallway floor. He rounded the corner, muscles coiled to strike. He stopped. The wrench slipped an inch in his grip. Standing at his sink, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender, pale arms, was Althea Vance, the CEO of Vance Dynamics. The woman whose silhouette was etched into the glass of the skyscraper Silas spent his nights maintaining. She was washing his dishes. The chipped ceramic mugs, Clara's plastic bowls, the greasy frying pan from a rushed breakfast. She looked out of place like a sapphire dropped into a coal bin. Her dark hair was loose damp from the rain, and for the first time in his life, Silas saw that the Ice Queen of Seattle had red-rimmed eyes. She wasn't wearing her usual armor of a tailored suit. She was wearing a silk blouse that was stained with water and dish soap. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady but lacking its usual predatory edge. She didn't turn around immediately. "I know how this looks. I'm not here to evict you." "Then why are you in my kitchen, Ms. Vance? Why are you touching my things?" Silas's voice was a low growl honed by years of solitude. Althea turned to face him, wiping her hands on a threadbare drying towel with a faded cartoon bear on it. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the grease on his face, the weariness in his posture, the wrench in his hand. "I spent the last 12 hours in the deep archives of our payroll department," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was looking for a leak in our offshore accounts. I was trying to save the quarter's earnings. I found something else instead." She stepped toward him, the smell of jasmine growing stronger, almost suffocating in the small space. "Dominic Sterling has been reporting you as a ghost senior manager for 24 months. According to the internal books, you are making $300,000 a year. That money is being funneled into a shell company in the Caymans. While you were in the basement, literally scrubbing the floors of the men who robbed you, Dominic was using your name to build his empire. You've been paying for his yachts with your silence." Silas felt a wave of nausea. He sank into a kitchen chair, the wrench clattering onto the laminate table. The weight of the revelation was a physical blow. He covered his face with his hands, the grease staining his skin. "I told him," Silas rasped, his voice cracking. "I told him the audit reports for the new Vance Tower were wrong. I told him the structural integrity was compromised. He told me if I ever spoke of it again, he'd make sure Clara ended up in the system. He said he had the power to make me disappear just like Sarah." Althea moved toward him, her shadow long and dark against the kitchen wall. She didn't sit. She stood a pillar of remorse. "I didn't know Silas. I was so focused on the legacy my father left me, so obsessed with being the perfect CEO, that I stopped looking at the people who actually built the company. I let a monster sit at my right hand." She gestured to the kitchen, the stacks of overdue bills, the notice from the power company, the drawings Clara had taped to the wall. "I've been here for 3 hours. I saw how you live. I sat here and I realized that every luxury I've enjoyed in the last 2 years was paid for in part by the blood you spilled in the dark. I came here to apologize, but I realize an apology is just more noise." She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. "I came here because I found the Black Ledger." Althea placed the book on the table. It was old, the edges frayed, smelling of dust and dark secrets. The Black Ledger. This was Dominic Sterling's private roadmap of corruption. It contained handwritten notes detailing the substitution of materials for the new Vance Tower, the company's flagship project. It documented every bribe paid to building inspectors and every cent stolen from the employee pension fund. But the most chilling entry was dated 3 years ago. Silas flipped to the page, his fingers trembling. "Project 702, fire sensor bypass authorized. Cost savings, 1.2 million. Liability managed via S. Thorne." The world tilted. The air left the room. Silas gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Tears, hot and angry, welled in his eyes. "He killed her," Silas whispered. He knew. He knew the sensors were offline in that building, and he sent the order to bypass them anyway, because it was cheaper than fixing the fault. He murdered Sarah for $1.2 million. "And he's doing it again," Althea whispered, her voice breaking. "The Vance Tower, the crown jewel of our city, he swapped the high-grade structural steel for grade 4 brittle alloys from an uncertified supplier. Silas, if the gala happens on Friday, the vibration of 1,000 people on the observation deck will cause the northeast pylon to shatter. The entire structure will undergo a progressive collapse. He's planning to let the building fall, blame it on my mismanagement, and walk away with $1 billion in insurance and stock shorts. We go to the police, Althea. Tonight, Silas said, standing up, his eyes burning with a sudden sharp clarity. We take this book to the FBI. We can't, Althea said, her hand reaching out but not quite touching his arm. The chief of police is in the ledger, Silas. Page 42. He's on Dominic's payroll. Dominic has spent years weaving a web of protection. If we go to the authorities, the evidence will disappear, and we will both be dead before sunrise. We have to expose him ourselves, in front of the world, in front of the cameras at the gala. For the first time in 3 years, Silas felt something other than exhaustion. He felt a cold, calculated rage. The architect was waking up. I know that building, he said softly. I designed the original specs before they demoted me. I know where he would have hidden the masking scripts for the sensors. But I need a high-end terminal and access to the internal hub. You have my credentials, and you have my apartment, Althea said. But we have to be invisible. Dominic has security details watching my penthouse. We work here. The next 3 days were a descent into a high-stakes game of digital warfare. Silas and Althea turned the cramped 2-bedroom apartment into a war room. Althea's $5,000 laptop sat on the scratch coffee table, surrounded by Silas's old technical manuals and Clara's Lego sets. Silas worked through the nights, his fingers flying across the keys as he hacked into the tower's internal monitoring system. He wasn't just looking for data, he was looking for a weapon. He found it in the sub-level 4-pylon sensors. Dominic had installed a masking script, a piece of code that sent a fake green signal to the main dashboard while the actual stress levels were skyrocketing. It's a slow-motion collapse, Silas explained, pointing at the flickering red lines on the screen that indicated microfractures in the foundation. The building is tilting 2 millimeters every day. By Friday night, the structural tension will be at 99% of its failure point. The music and the footsteps of the gala guests will be the final hammer blow. During these long hours, a quiet, unexpected intimacy grew between the fallen architect and the lonely CEO. Althea spent her afternoons with Clara, who was fascinated by Althea's sparkly world, but more interested in showing Althea her telescope. One evening, as rain lashed the windows, Clara sat on the floor with Althea. My daddy says the stars are like lanterns for people who are lost, Clara told Althea, her voice filled with the innocent wisdom of a 7-year-old. But he says sometimes the lanterns go out and we have to be the light ourselves. Are you a light, Miss Althea? Althea looked at Silas, who was hunched over his computer, his face lit by the cold blue glow of the screen. She looked at the grease under his fingernails and the strength in his back. She felt a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow. I'm trying to be Clara, she whispered. I'm trying to find the switch. But the darkness was closing in. On Thursday afternoon, Silas returned from a covert supply run, buying a high-gain antenna, to boost their signal only to find a manila envelope taped to his door. Inside were photos, Althea entering his apartment, Silas at the grocery store, and most terrifyingly, a photo of Clara at the school playground with a red cross drawn over her face. The burner phone inside the envelope rang instantly. Silas answered it, his voice a low growl of suppressed violence. You're playing a very dangerous game, Silas. Dominic Sterling's voice hissed through the speaker, smooth as silk and cold as a grave. You think Althea Vance cares about you? She's a Vance. She'll sacrifice you the moment the board of directors breathes down her neck. Walk away now, take the money I've put in your shell account, and the girl stays safe. Show up at the gala and you'll find out how deep a pylon hole can be. The line went dead. Silas stood in the hallway, the photo shaking in his hand. The trauma of losing Sarah surged back, choking him. But this time it was tempered by the iron will of a man who had already been through hell. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked back into the apartment and showed Althea the photos. "He's watching us," Silas said. "He knows." Althea looked at the photo of Clara. Her face hardened. The guilt was gone, replaced by a fierce protective fury. "Then we changed the plan," she said. "He thinks he's the architect of this tragedy. He doesn't realize we've already redesigned the ending." The night of the Vance Tower Gala arrived not with a celebration, but with a tension that felt like a coiled spring. The tower itself was a masterpiece of glass, and light a 300-story needle piercing the gray Seattle clouds. Searchlights swept the sky, casting long, frantic fingers of light over the thousands of onlookers gathered at the base. Inside the grand ballroom was a sanctuary of excessive wealth. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias, expensive bourbon, and the quiet, desperate hum of people trying to outshine one another. Dominic Sterling was in his absolute element. He moved through the crowd like a shark in silk, his teeth white against his tan, his hand resting comfortably on the small of the backs of senators and tech moguls. He was 45 minutes away from the greatest victory of his life. In his pocket, a thumb drive held the forged resignation of Althea Vance. He had built a guillotine, and he was about to watch the Ice Queen put her neck in it. Silas Thorne did not enter through the grand lobby. He entered through the service loading dock wearing the same faded gray coveralls he had worn for 2 years. To the high-tech security scanners, he was just Maintenance Tech 402. He carried a heavy toolbox, but inside, nestled between the wrenches and multimeters, was a custom-built signal interceptor, the Ghost Box he and Althea had stayed up until 4:00 a.m. perfecting. He made his way to the sub-level 4 structural hub. The air down here was cold, smelling of damp concrete and ozone. He could hear the faint, terrifying groan of the building, a sound no one upstairs could hear over the jazz band. It was the sound of grade 4 steel screaming under a load it was never meant to bear. Silas wiped the sweat from his eyes and opened the main junction box. His hands were steady. "Althea, I'm at the hub," he whispered into his microcoms. "The pylon stress is at 94%. The vibration from the dance floor is accelerating the fractures." "I see it, Silas." Althea's voice came back crystal clear. She was currently standing in the VIP lounge holding a glass of champagne. She hadn't touched, her eyes locked on Dominic. She wore a black dress that looked like mourning. "I'm moving toward the stage. My private security team has secured Clara at the safe house. We are go for the final phase." "Wait," Silas said, his fingers pausing over the wiring. "There's a secondary encryption here." Dominic added a failsafe. "If I kill the masking script, it triggers a total blackout of the building. He'll use the darkness to escape." "Do it anyway," Althea replied, her voice cold as the Seattle winter. "Let him run into the dark. We'll be waiting for him there." Silas took a deep breath. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the smell of lavender and the sound of her laughter that he was slowly forgetting. He thought about the 2 years he spent invisible, a ghost in the halls of his own creation. He cut the primary feed. Upstairs, the grand ballroom screens were supposed to show a pre-recorded video of the building's safety and innovation. Dominic Sterling stepped onto the stage, a microphone in hand, beaming at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic said, "tonight we celebrate perfection, and now I give you the heart of the tower." The massive 100-foot 8K LED screen behind him flickered. It didn't show a building. It showed a face, his own face. It was a hidden camera recording from 3 weeks ago, taken in the very office he now occupied. The audio boomed through the Bose surround system, drowning out the jazz band. "I don't care if the pylon cracks in 10 years, Ted. I only need it to stand until Monday. Use the cheap alloys. If Thorne complains, remind him that his daughter's school route is very public, and remind him that Sarah's death can be reopened as a murder investigation with him as the only suspect. I own the chief, and I own the truth." The ballroom became a tomb. The clinking of glasses stopped. The laughter died. 1,000 people turned their heads toward the stage, their faces reflecting the cold blue light of the confession. Dominic's tan turned a sickly shade of gray. He tapped the microphone, panic flaring in his eyes. "Turn it off. It's a deep fake security. Shut it down." But the security team didn't move. They were staring at their own tablets. Althea had triggered the kill switch. She had sent the entire black ledger, every bribe, every falsified audit, every payroll theft, to every guest, every news outlet, and every federal agent in the state of Washington at the exact same moment Silas cut the feed. Silas stepped out from the service elevator and onto the ballroom floor. He walked slowly, the crowd parting for him, like he was a shadow coming to life. He wasn't a technician tonight. He was the architect. He stepped onto the stage and stood 5 feet from the man who had ruined his life. "The building is tilting. Dominic," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "The northeast pylon is at 97%. You didn't build a legacy. You built a tomb. And the truth just broke the foundation." The chaos that followed was a blur of flashing lights and screaming sirens. The FBI, led by a field agent Althea had personally vetted, swarmed the stage. Dominic Sterling, the man who thought he was a king, was forced to the ground, his face pressed against the very Italian marble he had overcharged the company for. The ghost had finally become a witness, and the witness had become a judge. As the building was evacuated and the elite of Seattle fled into the rain, Silas and Althea stood on the sidewalk across the street. They watched the Vance Tower, the glass needle that was now a symbol of corporate greed. It stood dark and silent against the skyline. It wouldn't be allowed to stand. It would be dismantled piece by crooked piece. "It's over," Silas said, the rain washing the grease from his hands for the first time in years. He felt lighter, as if a literal weight had been lifted from his spine. "No," Althea said, looking at him with a softness he hadn't seen before. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she didn't care. "It's just starting. We have 42 families to compensate. We have a company to rebuild from the ashes, and I have a debt to pay to a man named Silas Thorne." "You don't owe me anything, Althea. You gave me back my name." "I gave you back a name that should never have been taken," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "But you gave me back my soul." 1 year later, the Seattle sun was finally shining a rare and brilliant gold that turned the Puget Sound into a sheet of hammered metal. In a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood far from the glass skyscrapers of downtown, a new house stood. It wasn't a mansion. It was a sturdy 2-story craftsman built with the finest materials and the most precise engineering the world had ever seen. Silas Thorne sat on the porch, a sketchbook in his lap. He wasn't designing skyscrapers anymore. He was the lead architect for the Thorne Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to building safe, affordable housing for the families the corporate world had forgotten. He wore a clean flannel shirt, and the dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by the laugh lines of a man who smiled often. Clara ran across the lawn, her laughter clear and bright. She was chasing a golden retriever puppy named Orbit, her coat flying behind her. She looked healthy, her eyes full of the light that Silas had fought so hard to protect. She stopped and ran up to the porch holding a drawing she had made in school. "Look, Daddy, it's the Northern Star," she said, climbing into his lap. "Because no matter where we go, it always shows us how to get home." Althea stepped out of the front door, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She had traded her power suits for a soft sweater and jeans. She sat down in the rocker next to Silas, her shoulder brushing his. "The board meeting for the Sarah Thorne Memorial Fund went well," she said, her voice full of a peace she had never known as a CEO. "We've officially broken ground on the new community center. It's going to be beautiful, Silas." Silas took Althea's hand. His skin was still rough. His hands still bore the scars of the maintenance years, but they were no longer stained with grease. They were the hands of a builder. "Clara asked me something this morning," Althea said, looking at the girl playing in the yard. "What's that?" "She asked if I was going to be her new architect, if I was going to help you design the forever part of our house." Silas looked at Althea, the woman who had walked into his kitchen and washed his dishes when his world was in pieces. He saw the strength in her eyes and the love she had cultivated for a child that wasn't hers. He saw the partner he never thought he would find. "And what did you tell her?" Silas asked. Althea leaned over and kissed him a kiss that tasted like coffee and home and the end of a very long storm. "I told her that the house was already built. I'm just here to make sure the foundation stays solid." In the distance, the first stars of the evening began to blink into existence. The northern star shone brightly over the house Silas had built. He realized then that success wasn't measured in the height of a building or the zeros in a bank account. It was measured in the safety of a child's laughter and the hand of a partner who stayed when the lights went out. The silent architect had finally finished his masterpiece, and for the first time in his life, the foundation was perfect.